Gentle reader, may you never feel what I then felt. May your eyes never shed such stormy, scalding, heart-wrung tears as poured from mine. May you never appeal to heaven in prayer so hopeless and so agonized as in that hour left my lips. For never may you, like me, dread to be the instrument of evil to what you wholly love. I spent the past 2 months reading one novel from each of the Brontë sisters, and this is one of the many quotes I have stuck in my mind. I will not reveal the context just yet, but let's go back in time for a minute and imagine this. You're living in a society characterized by rapid changes, heightened by the Industrial Revolution, with social classes differentiated by hard-drawn lines, where the poor working class barely stands a chance of overcoming their condition, while the upper and relatively newly formed middle class, though sympathizing with their less fortunate peers, also fear with great anxiety the possibility of them escaping their fate and achieving the status the latter so dearly cherish. Moreover, this society is one of strict rules and morals, many of them driven by religious beliefs and patriarchy, where women's rights are many decades away from being introduced. Well, welcome to the 1800s. I highly praise the writers who had the audacity to depict society for what it was, arising in their readers' moral and ethical dilemmas and conflicts between their individual aspirations and society's expectations. The Brontë sisters wrote about all of this, and under the circumstances, it is no surprise that they originally chose to publish their books under male pen names. Even so, they were not spared from public criticism. The books themselves were in many ways a criticism of that very public, who most probably feared the empowerment their oppressed citizens would benefit from. Now, I can only imagine what those who truly appreciated these books must have felt. With whom were they discussing them in their small and closed societies? Were they the women doomed to live at their husband's mercy, with no dreams of their own other than serving according to their proper duty? Were they people of higher aspirations failed by society's conservative ways? I would like to think that the poor working class was also reading these books, but we already know they lacked the skills and means to do so. The themes and ideas the Brontë sisters wrote about were way ahead of their time. And I believe it is important for modern society to see the foundation of the world we live in today unfold on these pages. Jane Eyre is often referred to as a romance novel, which I think does a big disservice to the book and the character herself. Yes, the romance is definitely a plot point which complements the narrative wonderfully. But this is Jane's coming-of-age story, her journey from a miserable childhood to an independent adult, and I dare say, shockingly for Victorian society, an independent woman. The reader's first encounter with Jane Eyre is at Gateshead Hall, where at 10 years old she is living with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her children. We immediately learn that Jane is not quite welcomed at the manor, and her only known relatives treat her badly. It is in this context that we first hear Jane's inner thoughts and get a sense of her character, while also understanding the tone of the story that lies ahead of us. Jane starts as an outcast, and we follow her search for belongingness in a world filled with obstacles in the way of reaching her full potential. Charlotte Brontë chose the perfect structure and the perfect elements to showcase this quest. And by breaking the fourth wall and addressing the reader directly, she doesn't only take us along the journey, But she also makes us a partner and a supporter of many such character developments that go beyond fiction. The novel is split into 5 parts, each of them happening in a different location, and highlighting an important phase from Jane's life and evolution. By changing the setting and introducing new characters with each switch, Brontë makes a clear delimitation and brings to the reader's attention the significant events and teachings the respective period offers to Jane, helping her to lastly find her true self and place in the world. The gothic and supernatural elements that Brontë uses throughout the novel set the mood and contribute to the high anxiety felt not only by the characters but by the readers themselves when it comes to the social class, culture, religion, and gender hierarchy issues portrayed in the book. While reading the book, I kept wondering how much of herself Charlotte Brontë put into the character of Jane Eyre. Some aspects from the book were inspired from her real life, but what could have driven her to write such a strong and resilient individual that would prove to resonate with people up to date? I personally believe that Charlotte Brontë based Jane Eyre on herself. From not fitting beauty standards, tall with rosy cheeks, cherry mouth, and a straight nose, to her way of thinking and the principles she promoted. Jane is aware of society's shortcomings when it comes to morals and values. Though she was raised with those very strict rules, very much like Charlotte Brontë, she has struggles of her own conforming to those rules. She not only speaks her mind in an authentic way, but her strong beliefs and own desires drive all of her actions in finding independence and overcoming the restrictive role that society attributed to women. Jane wants to benefit from the freedom that her more privileged fellow creatures benefit from. She wants to earn her own money, and she wants to find her equal in mind and spirit. It is for her soul that she wants to be loved and valued in the detriment of beauty, and she wants to marry for love, because she knows a loveless marriage would not suit her. Again, how could somebody write about all those beliefs, struggles, and in many ways inner battles without experiencing them? Because yes, Jane, and most likely Charlotte, had 2 selves which I believe fought each other for triumph, the rational self and the passionate self. And in the end, only by finding the right balance between them, only by getting to know oneself well enough, by successfully navigating society's moral pressures and hypocrisies, could they achieve the ultimate fulfillment in life. And with the risk of repeating myself, this is what Jane Eyre is all about. Now, for a more in-depth analysis, I will have to give away some important plot points and interpretations, so in case you haven't read the book, you might want to skip this part. I already mentioned that the book starts at Gateshead Hall, where we see Jane Eyre treated miserably by her aunt Mrs. Reed and her children. These early chapters offer some information about Jane's origin, and though ambiguous in lots of ways, they do foreshadow some later events while also explaining some of Jane's traits and her fate at the Gateshead Manor. The late Mr. Reed was Jane's maternal uncle who took her into his own family and loved her as his own daughter when both her parents died of typhus 1 year after Jane was born. Jane's mother defied her wealthy family by marrying a poor clergyman, and in this way she was disowned by her father, who in a patriarchal structure possessed absolute power. With this we have the first example where society's boundaries are banned, And we also get an idea of where Jane inherited her passionate ways. Mrs. Reed, being a devoted follower of society's norms, hated Jane for having no fortune of her own and for winning her husband's affection. She felt as if he was favoring her more than his own children, who in her eyes had valuable qualities that Jane did not possess. One event worth mentioning in these early chapters is the punishment Jane receives from her aunt after she defended herself from her older cousin's bullying. She is locked in the so-called Red Room where her uncle had died many years ago. This physical imprisonment represents a symbol of the many metaphorical imprisonments that Jane will have to face throughout the book. The next place where we see Jane is at Lowood School, where her aunt sent her away, thus breaking the vow she made at her husband's deathbed to take care of Jane. Seems that Victorian society didn't care much about that. But before leaving, Jane makes some truthful statements to her aunt. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. I will never come to see you when I am grown up. And if anyone asks me how I liked you and how you treated me, I will say the very thought of you makes me sick and that you treated me with miserable cruelty. People think you a good woman, but you are bad, hard-hearted. You are deceitful. Lowood School was an institution for poor and orphaned girls run by Mr. Brocklehurst, who was a big hypocrite. Not only did he continue the cruel treatment towards Jane Eyre, but he also justified his deceitful traits with religious beliefs and promoted severe privation while offering his daughters a life of luxury. It is at Lowood School that Jane befriends Helen Burns. Helen has a short stay in the novel, but through her philosophy she teaches Jane a valuable lesson. In order to be happy, one should not hold any grudges. We acknowledge this lesson later in the novel when Jane, despite her earlier statements, returns to her aunt's deathbed and offers her forgiveness, regardless of Mrs. Reed's feelings towards her being unchanged and unchangeable. After receiving her education at Lowood School and also working there as a teacher for 2 years, Jane feels it's time for a change and moves to Thornfield Hall, where she is hired as a governess for Adele Warrens. The legal guardian of little Adele is Mr. Rochester, the long-awaited love interest of Jane. And I have to admit that I quite liked the dynamic between Jane and Mr. Rochester. I loved their discussions, their teasings, and how they could be themselves around each other, truly equal in mind and spirit. Now, I have to admit that I also fought an inner battle of love versus hate towards Mr. Rochester, as he is portrayed as a morally grey character. I believe the most controversial aspect of Mr. Rochester is the existence of his mentally ill wife Bertha, kept in the attic of the manor. There are several interpretations that more acclaimed readers and critics than me have made in attempt to understand what Bertha represents in the novel. My initial thought was that she represents an obstacle, keeping Jane and Mr. Rochester away from their union and their everlasting happiness. But upon a deeper thought, I believe there are many nuances to her story and her character. Charlotte Brontë managed to highlight the anxieties felt towards such individuals in those times. First of all, let's not forget that not long before the events of this book, mentally ill people were often accused of witchcraft and cruelly executed. Not to mention that the majority of those people were women. Now, Bertha is also referred to in the novel as a Creole, a mixed-race descendant, bringing to our attention the age of imperialism and Europe's colonization of other parts of the world. Taking these three factors into consideration, We cannot ignore the conclusion that locking Bertha into an asylum would have done more bad than good for her. So, divorce being basically impossible, young Rochester decided to take Bertha at Thornfield and keep her a secret while he goes on his quest of finding true love and happiness. Mr. Rochester is definitely not the conventional hero, neither a good nor a bad person. But is he to be condemned to an ill-fated life for the rest of his years? A speech he gives quite early in the book acknowledges his past mistakes. I have plenty of faults of my own. I know it and I don't wish to palliate them, I assure you. I have a past existence, a series of deeds. I started, or rather was thrust onto a wrong track at the age of 21 and have never recovered the right course since. I envy you, your peace of mind, your clean conscience, your unpolluted memory. The truth is that, to some degree, Rochester is a victim himself. The part where he explains Jane how he was tricked into marriage with Bertha made me ache. His father's greed made him overlook the genetic disorder that ran into Bertha's family, while the prospect of a great fortune was on the horizon. On the other hand, Bertha's family wanted her to marry Rochester because he was of a good race. Again, Brontë is bringing to attention some disgraceful values that people thought of importance. In this part of the book, there are also some of the most impactful quotes that I could not bring myself to omit. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. I believe these are Charlotte's words as much as Jane's. They have a powerful meaning and reflect the confinement many women were facing in those times. Often, the only escape was through one's imagination and creativity, which Charlotte Brontë put into practice in her writings. Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, nor even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet, equal as we are. Another powerful statement that addresses the equality between men and women despite the absurd rules dictated by society. I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. Well, I respect you, Jane. And returning to the quote with which I started this video, that is the last paragraph ending Jane's time at Thornfield Hall. For though torn in two, Jane decides to leave the place and Mr. Rochester with it. Following Jane's journey to this point, the reader cannot be surprised by her decision. We have seen Jane's evolution and learnings. We have seen her fearful character and strong principles. She will definitely not settle for something she thinks is not morally appropriate and would not allow her to live the life she hopes for herself. And thus, she needs to conquer one final quest before her happily ever after. In the next part, we see Jane finding her way to the Moor house. If I didn't cry much until now, I most certainly did at this part. It was heartbreaking to see her struggles alone again with no money and even at her lowest, trying to keep her head up and her dignity, while people rejected her once again. Fortunately, it is at the Moor house where Jane finds her long-lost family and comes to inherit the very much hinted at fortune of her uncle John Eyre. Once again, Jane shows her true character when she is happier to finally have a family than to have money, which she decides to share with her cousins. In this part of the book, it is important to mention St. John's marriage proposal, which Jane declines for lack of romantic love towards him. By refusing him in a way, she refuses to conform to society's expectations. St. John would be considered by many of her contemporaries a good match. He's a devoted Christian, and through his rigid beliefs and stoic character, he would have been able to temper her passionate instincts and make her lead the submissive life that moral duty would ask from a Christian woman. And though Jane has learned by now to interpret Christian virtue without dismissing her own feelings, she finds St. John's practice suffocating, especially when many others in her past have used religion as a pretext to treat her cruelly. With this, Jane comes to realize that her true happiness, her true home as she expresses earlier in the novel, is next to Mr. Rochester. She goes back to Thornfield Hall only to find it burnt to the ground by Bertha, who is now dead, and learns that Mr. Rochester is living on a farm at Ferndale. With the burning of Thornfield Hall, it seems that the shadows of the past are finally gone, but not before leaving some consequences behind. In his attempt to save Bertha from the fire, Mr. Rochester is left a disabled blind man, thus receiving his sentence for his earlier transgressions. I will come to his aid once again and say that despite the doomed life he lived next to Bertha, he did try to save her until the very end. Jane finds Mr. Rochester at Ferndale and finally accepts to marry him, for she has now learned that submitting to her passions doesn't necessarily mean losing oneself, but finding new purpose and meaning while one's strengths and principles remain intact. Jane marries Rochester on her own terms and as his equal. Yes, her inheritance and the gender role switch at the end might have helped, but only by overcoming all the obstacles and all the prejudices established by society and religion was it possible to free themselves from the cages that confined their spirits. Just like with Jane Eyre, I will start by saying this is not a romance novel. I read it for the first time when I was in high school, and I've wanted to reread it ever since. It took me almost 1.5 decades to do so, but I feel it came at the right time. I will be honest and say that I did not remember much from my first read other than the love story and a few elements that I found quite disturbing at the time. In a way, I believe I knew I did not get the most of it, and since I read the translation, I always said I will want to read the original one day. Let's not get fooled by the poetic and lyrical way the book was written and romanticize it. The novel is an illustration of many wrongs that were happening at that time. It is no coincidence that the story starts in 1801. Emily Brontë is very particular with the timeline, and she wants the reader to acknowledge the historical context she chose to place her narrative in. I believe this is a novel that will haunt the reader forever, and not just because of the gothic and supernatural elements found throughout. Regarding the storytelling itself, it is important to understand that we are dealing with an unreliable and biased narrator, that of Nellie Dean, who through the character of Lockwood, that is bringing the story to the public's attention, attention, constantly manipulates how readers perceive and react to the characters and events portrayed in this almost nightmarish setting. Therefore, it is crucial to read between the lines, as nothing is truly related from the perspective of those directly involved in the story. Now, I absolutely love this book. However, I am still conflicted when it comes to many aspects of it, but I guess that's the beauty in the case of such creations. For many, the book and the characters themselves represent an enigma, and trying to understand that can leave one even more puzzled. The characters are far from being perfect. On many occasions, they are portrayed as vile, superficial, driven by pride, ego, and revenge, and they often switch from a position of victim to one of victimizer. Some of them outgrow these wretched traits, and some become consumed by them. Emily Brontë is playing with her readers, teasing and testing them to the point of emotional surrender. One can feel both compassion and hatred towards the same character. I believe the biggest victim in this book is Heathcliff. Yes, you've heard me right. Heathcliff is not only the victim of Hindley Earnshaw, but he represents all the Heathcliffs that society rejected through the deceitful values they promoted, all the Heathcliffs that were denied to overcome their condition and pushed to the limit of becoming the exact thing that society feared the most. Heathcliff's origins are not a random happening. We learn from the very first pages that he is a gypsy, and he is referred to as such in a hateful and shameful way several times. Then we also learn that he is a poor starving orphan that liberal old Mr. Earnshaw found in one of his journeys to Liverpool, took pity on him and brought him back to Wuthering Heights. The Liverpool detail is extremely important for understanding the statement this narrative implies. During the 18th and the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution took place, and with it, new orders in society emerged. On the one hand, we have the making of the English working class, and on the other, the rise of the middle class, both of them accentuating the disparity born between social or economic statuses. Now, at that time, Liverpool was an industrial center where lots of immigrants settled as factory workers. Therefore, only by mentioning that Heathcliff is a gypsy that comes from Liverpool, we can imagine the nature of his origins. In doing so, Emily Brontë explored in her novel all the anxieties that the upper class was feeling towards individuals like Heathcliff, all the racism and inequality they expressed towards them. And then society was shocked when those individuals rebelled and revolted. I believe Emily Brontë wanted to show us the consequences of such conduct and to force us to overcome our prejudices, the same way she does in the ending of the book, where she metaphorically portrays the social change that Britain has gone through those decades. Now, as I did with Jane Eyre, I will go into a deeper analysis and give away some quotes and interpretations I found important, so in case you haven't read the book, you might want to skip to the next part. I hinted already that the historical context is extremely important. Heathcliff came into the Earnshaw family at a crucial moment when social, economic, and cultural orders were disrupted by the Industrial Revolution. Emily Brontë explored the tensions created by these rapid changes by the way Heathcliff was received and treated at Wuthering Heights. He was perceived as a threat not only by Hindley Earnshaw, who was next in line, but also by Nellie Dean, the long devoted servant of the family. In her narration, Nellie Dean portrays herself as a superior, well-educated servant, almost part of the Earnshaw family, as she often used to play with the children and be regarded as one of them. She frequently associates herself with her masters rather than with the servants. This is enhanced by the fact that she is well-spoken, while Joseph, another servant of the house, speaks in a Yorkshire dialect which was considered representative of the less educated and of people with a lower status. These aspects are important in order to understand how biased Nellie Dean is as a narrator, and why the reader should never trust her words. She frequently disguises the truth, adds her own opinions as if they were coming from those entitled to express them, misjudges information, and portrays the characters and herself in the light she wants her audience to perceive them. And of course, it all comes down to Heathcliff, as he is the biggest enigma of this novel. She felt the danger and disorder a devilish gypsy like Heathcliff could bring in the lives of those, including herself, living at Wuthering Heights and later at Thrushcross Grange. Therefore, she tries to make sure the reader feels the same. However, our first encounter with Heathcliff is through the eyes of Mr. Lockwood, his tenant at Thrushcross Grange, and also the narrator who introduces and walks us through the story. It can be argued that Lockwood is also an unreliable narrator, not for the same reasons as Nellie Dean is, but because he seems to not always make the obvious assessment of a situation. He also has a sense of superiority which makes him unlikable, and that subconsciously translates into untrustworthiness. Despite that, his first instinct when he sees Heathcliff is to describe him as a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, in dress and manners a gentleman, that is, as much a gentleman as many a country squire. His sympathetic court made him overlook the prejudice that race would have implied, and because he is so intrigued by Heathcliff's mysterious and misunderstood persona, he persuades Nellie into telling him the story of Wuthering Heights. It is interesting to see how this first description of Heathcliff will be drastically altered through the tellings of Nellie Dean, who, despite trying to portray herself in a good light, is unable to hide her racist behavior and her manipulative character. In the book, there is one important act that sets the narrative on its course. It's the scene where Catherine Earnshaw tells Nellie that Edgar Linton, her neighbor from Thrushcross Grange, asked her to marry him and she accepted him. Asked by Nellie why she thinks she loves Edgar, Catherine lists all these superficial reasons. He is handsome, pleasant, he loves her, he is rich, and he will make her the greatest woman of the neighborhood. However, she admits that in her heart she knows all of this is wrong. But then she goes on saying that to marry Heathcliff, which is obvious to this point that he is the one she loves, so to marry Heathcliff would degrade her. After their father's death, Hindley treated Heathcliff miserably, making him a servant and denying him any access to education, thus bringing him to such a low level that Catherine could not even think of a union with him. Unfortunately, Heathcliff hears all of that and is deeply wounded by this confirmation from the person he loves the most. He understands that he will be a castaway forever and never integrated into the society where his family probably came in hopes of better opportunities. Even as a child, Heathcliff was aware of the limitations that his class and race would bring to him. I wish I had light hair and a fair skin, and was dressed and behaved as well, and had the chance of being as rich as he will be. And hearing those words from Catherine was the last nail in the coffin. He runs from the heights in order to achieve the wealth and status so greatly valued by society. It is important to highlight that Nellie was aware he heard the discussion, but she did not mention it to Catherine. Not until she couldn't conceal it anymore and he was long gone. And this is one of the many examples where Nellie's manipulative character comes into play. Towards the end of the novel, she confesses her abuses in a rather truthful declaration, which she tries to hide under the veil of imagination. I seated myself in a chair and rocked to and fro, passing harsh judgment on my many derelictions of duty, from which it struck me then all the misfortunes of my employer sprang. It was not the case in reality, I am aware, but it was in my imagination that dismal night, and I thought Heathcliff himself less guilty than I. In this act I mentioned before, are also present some of the most memorable quotes which tend to be romanticized a lot. He's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. I am Heathcliff. He's always in my mind, not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. Here the idea of soulmates is showcased, and that of non-conventional love. In literature, love is usually portrayed between two opposites, the same way that Catherine describes Edgar Linton and herself, moonbeam and lightning, fire and ice. But her love to Heathcliff is different, between two passionate and untamed spirits. A wild love, similar to the moors on which Catherine and Heathcliff used to run so often as children, a love that would defy the Victorian standards, which had a rigid view on the duties of marriage, especially those of the female part of that union. I will go beyond this explanation and offer another interpretation. In stating she is Heathcliff and their souls are made of the same material, Catherine transcends the race, class, and gender stereotypes that humans attribute to themselves. She is stating that somebody born a poor dark-skinned gypsy can have the same spirit as somebody born in a wealthy and well-bred family. After Heathcliff runs off from the heights, he comes back as a wealthy man and starts his quest for revenge. At this point, a shift of perspective takes place, and if the reader was feeling sympathetic towards his character, they now start to be shocked by his actions. Thus, the victim becomes the villain. The climax of the story is reached with Catherine's death, and it is worth mentioning that Emily Brontë did not shy away from foreshadowing any characters dying. I believe this event makes Heathcliff even more bitter. For now, the only person he ever loved and loved him back is dead, and nothing could bring him happiness anymore. The only option is to continue his vengeance and not rest until he succeeds. After 30 years or so since he first came into the Earnshaw family, all his old nemesis are dead, and a new generation of Earnshaw and Linton has grown up. Hareton Earnshaw, the son of Hindley and his wife, whom we meet only briefly, and Cathy Linton, the daughter of Catherine and Edgar Linton. Heathcliff is the owner of both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, but he is now starting to show signs of fatigue. I will call what Emily Brontë describes in the book depression. His successful revenge did not bring him any satisfaction, and this is one of the many things we learn from watching these characters closely. He stops eating and eventually becomes delusional, seeing and feeling Catherine's presence everywhere. In the end, I believe he wanted to be reunited with her spirit. The entire world is a dreadful collection of memoranda that she did exist and that I have lost her. These words are haunting when we think of what they represent. Catherine was not only the love of his life, but she was the one that could have saved him. She was the one that saw him for what he truly was. Unfortunately, that was not enough. She betrayed her heart, and he lost her twice. And now, he was prepared to die. The next paragraph is even more haunting once we realized the implications made. Mr. Kenneth was perplexed to pronounce of what disorder the master died. I concealed the fact of his having swallowed nothing for 4 days, fearing it might lead to trouble, and then I am persuaded he did not abstain on purpose. It was the consequence of his strange illness, not the cause. Yes, almost 200 years ago, somebody wrote in a fictional novel that depression can lead to death. With Heathcliff's death and the union of Cathy Linton and Hareton Earnshaw, everything seems to go into a new phase. I would like to emphasize that Cathy and Hareton represent what Catherine and Heathcliff could have been. If Catherine had overcome her prejudices, Hareton was raised by Heathcliff the same way Hindley raised him, an uneducated servant. But despite her initial reaction to Hareton's condition, Cathy goes beyond those preconceptions and accepts him, while also trying to help with his education. Moreover, Hareton, an uneducated brute, is now the owner of Wuthering Heights, and Cathy, a Victorian woman, is the owner of Thrushcross Grange. In this way, Emily Brontë explored how Britain was gradually ready to embrace the social, economic, and cultural changes that the Industrial Revolution started. Many readers and critics consider Jane Eyre to be a feminist novel, and while Charlotte Brontë did promote a lot of feminist concepts throughout her book, I would argue and say that The Tenant of Wildfell Hall from her sister Anne Brontë is the true feminist novel in the family. The character of Jane Eyre has an intense inner life, and she frequently questions a lot of moralities regarding gender roles, social class, and religion. However, she is not always a confident feminist. She is sometimes troubled by society's standards and her inability to conform. When it comes to Helen Graham, the female protagonist from The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, she is the strong, brave, and independent woman who didn't shy away from speaking her mind and who acted according to her own values and needs. She was the woman that would have definitely scandalized Victorian society. In her novel, Anne Brontë explores many troubling aspects of Victorian society that were a taboo discourse for those conservative and rigid times, but I will not reveal them just yet. First, I will tell you that this was a heavily criticized and censored book. My copy has the author's preface to the second edition, where Anne addresses this harsh judgment, and her words are so deeply imprinted in my mind that I could not simply disregard them here. When we have to do with vice and vicious characters, I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear. I know that such characters do exist, and if I have warned one rash youth from following in their steps, or prevented one thoughtless girl from falling into the very natural error of my heroine, the book has not been written in vain. Yet, be it understood, I shall not limit my ambition to this, or even to producing a perfect work of art. Time and talent so spent I should consider wasted and misapplied. Such humble talents as God has given me, I will endeavor to put to their greatest use. If I am able to amuse, I will try to benefit too. And when I feel it my duty to speak an unpalatable truth, with the help of God I will speak it, though it be to the prejudice of my name and to the detriment of my readers' immediate pleasure as well as my own. Reading these words, I knew that what I was about to witness needed my full attention. Helen Graham is portrayed as a young widow that has moved with her son to the abandoned Wildfell Hall after her husband's death. This change in scenery has incited a lot of gossip around those living in the neighborhood and has made Gilbert Markham, our narrator, curious about her mysterious persona. As we progress through the story, we learn the shocking details years of Helen's marriage and the darkness that surrounded her past. We do so through her diary entries that she has given to Gilbert as a testimony of her character and truthfulness. I am aware of the criticism brought to Anne Brontë in regards to her narration style and the fact that she chose to cover herself behind a diary rather than tell a straightforward story. First of all, I would like to once again emphasize the controversial and outrageous nature of the themes presented in this book for the Victorian era. It definitely took a lot of courage to write about all of that. Secondly, I believe that this choice was made deliberately to highlight that women did not have many confidants and allies with whom to talk about their hopeless situations both at home and in society. So, turning to a diary was a way of letting go of all the suppressed emotions. Let's also not forget that women were seen as an extension of their husbands, and it was considered their lawful and moral duty to please and entertain them while taking care of the household. Divorce was uncommon and hard to obtain by ordinary people, and when it came to women, they had no right to ask for a divorce or to take custody of their own children, regardless of any misbehavior from their husbands. I will now go into a deeper analysis, so please feel free to skip this part if you haven't read the book and want to avoid spoilers. Okay, so having in mind what I said a few seconds ago, this novel is the story of a woman who takes her child, leaves her abusive husband, and makes a living on her own. I already mentioned that Helen Graham is initially portrayed as a widow. However, the horrifying events and Helen's true character are foreshadowed quite early in the novel. There is a scene in chapter 3 that stuck in my mind where her 5-year-old son is offered a glass of wine. Shockingly for modern readers, this was a common practice for those times. And I was reminded of Jane Eyre, where young children were depicted drinking coffee, for instance. With this little detail, an interesting discourse arises between Helen and her companions. From the conversation, Helen's averse nature towards drinking becomes clear, and her idea of the education she wants to offer her son also rises to the surface. She wants to teach him to avoid temptation rather than taste it and try to resist it. This incites the participants to a heated discussion in which Helen is harshly criticized for her beliefs. They think a boy should face the evils of temptation in order to grow into a strong, hardy man. However, they would not offer the same education to a girl, which Helen challenges by saying, "You would have her to be tenderly and delicately nurtured like a hothouse plant, taught to cling to others for direction and support, and guarded as much as possible from the very knowledge of evil. But will you be so good as to inform me why you make this distinction? Is it that you think she has no virtue?" This paragraph is so important as it shows how women and men were raised from a very young age to become what society has defined as appropriate for their gender. Men were the strong ones. Men were free to do whatever they pleased, yield to temptation or resist it, while women clinged to others for direction and support. Who do you think those others were? Throughout the novel, we are constantly reminded what the norm was back then. "The cases are different," he replied. "It is a woman's nature to be constant, to love one and one only, blindly, tenderly, and forever. Bless them, dear creatures." Judging from appearances, his idea of a wife is a thing to love one devotedly and to stay at home to wait upon her husband and amuse him and minister to his comfort in every possible way while he chooses to stay with her, and when he is absent, to attend to his interests, domestic or otherwise, and patiently wait his return no matter how he may be occupied in the meantime. For you are a man and free to act as you please. You'll do your business, and she, if she's worthy of you, will do hers. But it's your business to please yourself, and hers to please you. I honestly do not even know how to feel when I read these words. Disgusted, enraged, grateful that I did not live in those times or in other parts of the world. But let's go back to Helen. Our first encounters with her make us wonder how she ended up marrying Arthur Huntington, especially when many troubling signs were already there. I believe it is quite obvious by now that Arthur had a drinking problem, and that was just one of his many faults. He was a selfish, arrogant manipulator who I'm pretty sure suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. He wanted to be adored and pleased in all things. He frequently manipulated Helen, teasing her, playing with her mind and feelings, trying to make her jealous in hopes to excite absolute worship from herself. He tricked her with his charms, telling her exactly what he knew she wanted to hear, that he will be a virtuous and devoted man, for she is the one that aroused in him noble intentions. In reality, he wanted a trophy wife to display to his friends and acquaintances, a wife that would make him look good to the public's eye, and above all, a submissive wife. When Helen failed to meet his expectations, he went on and cheated on her, bringing his mistresses to their own house without any shame. He started being jealous of their own son, who needed the attention a mother should offer a newborn. He wanted to have her full attention, but he was not willing to do so in return. When he was away taking care of his affairs, to be translated into drinking, gambling, and cheating, he demanded she write to him daily. For what could she do all day anyway other than think of him and wait patiently for his return? Anne Brontë wrote this character as a warning to all the girls that did not know better than to fall into the traps of such characters, and to all the boys inclined to become such individuals. So why did Helen marry Arthur? She was only 18 when she first met him, and she experienced for the first time what it was like to desire somebody. I wonder whether he ever thinks of me, and I wonder whether I shall ever see him again. And then might follow a train of other wonderments, questions for time and fate to answer, concluding with, supposing all the rest be answered in the affirmative, I wonder whether I shall ever repent it, as my aunt would tell me I should, if she knew what I was thinking about. I already explained that Arthur was a manipulator, and he knew exactly what to do and what to say in order to win Helen on his side. She was delighted by his charms, and she would not listen to any warnings, even those that she observed herself. She reasoned them as part of his outgoing personality. She also thought she could be a good influence on him, especially when he made her believe so on many occasions. He says that if he had me always by his side, he should never do or say a wicked thing, and that a little daily talk with me would make him quite a saint. But the wish to try to reform him and teach him virtue might come from other places as well. At the beginning of her diary, we learn that Helen has been raised by her uncle and her aunt after her mother's death. It is later in the novel, when she's already married and her biological father dies, that we find out he also had a drinking problem, which was the cause of his death. Did Helen see in Arthur the possibilities that her father denied her? Was she sympathetic towards people like him? Did she want to help him as she was not able to with her father? Helen was such a resilient woman and so ahead of her time that it is hard not to acknowledge the road she paved for all the women that might find themselves in her situation. She knew well that she was not inferior to men, and she would not accept to be treated as such. There are many such examples throughout the book, and I will highlight two of my favorites. Without another word, I left the room and locked myself up in my own chamber. In about half an hour, he came to the door, and first he tried the handle, then he knocked. "Won't you let me in, Helen?" said he. "No, you have displeased me," I replied, "and I don't want to see your face or hear your voice again till the morning." "And so," said he at length, "you thought to disgrace me, did you, by running away and turning artist, and supporting yourself by the labor of your hands, forsooth? And you thought to rob me of my son too, and bring him up to be a dirty Yankee tradesman or a low beggarly painter. Yes, to obviate his becoming such a gentleman as his father." Helen's greatest act of bravery was to leave her abusive husband and take her child with her. Once again, such a thing was not just uncommon but practically against the law back then. She initially tried to talk Arthur into allowing her to do so, but he saw no reason as he couldn't let his pride and ego be affected by the gossip around town. Moreover, he started blaming her for his drinking and his shortcomings, continuing his abuse with no remorse. Left with no choice, Helen planned her escape thoroughly, and she didn't give up until she succeeded. In order to provide for her and her son, she started selling her paintings as a source of income. In this way, she might have become one of the very first independent single mothers. Now one might ask themselves why, after winning her freedom and her peace of mind, did Helen go back to Arthur when he was sick and in agony? Why did she take care of him when he treated her so miserably? Throughout the book, we learn of Helen's religious views that many modern reviewers criticize her for, but I will not do so. I accept her as she is, regardless if I share her beliefs or not. Shouldn't we all want to live with a free conscience? I believe Helen returned to Arthur for the same reason Jane Eyre returned to her aunt's deathbed: to offer forgiveness and to avoid having to live a life of remorse. Arthur was her son's father, and a human being after all. She wanted to do anything in her power to save him, and she tried until the very end. I do not believe that this diminishes her previous actions in any way. And I would like to highlight that Helen is not the only feminist promoter in the novel. Trust me, I will. I threaten Mama sometimes that I'll run away and disgrace the family by earning my own livelihood if she torments me anymore. And then that frightens her a little. But I will do it in good earnest if they don't mind. These were the words of Esther Hargrave, Helen's friend, whom she supported with earnest advice and for whom very likely she represented an inspiration. And then there is also Gilbert, whom I only mentioned briefly so far. He has one of the most memorable remarks which occurs quite early in the novel. "When I marry, I shall expect to find more pleasure in making my wife happy and comfortable than in being made so by her. I would rather give than receive." His words here and the fact that Helen marries Gilbert by the end of the book, we can't help but think that Helen got the man she deserved in the end. One that would take care of her, one that would appreciate and respect her, tend to her needs. He was the opposite of Arthur. In a way, this also shows emotional and spiritual growth on Helen's side. She was now able to recognize the virtuous qualities in a man and to recognize an honest love. And because this novel needs to be an empowerment to women until the very end, Helen is the one that asks Gilbert to marry her, with a declaration that sums up her entire story. This rose is not so fragrant as a summer flower, but it has stood through hardships none of them could bear. The cold rain of winter has sufficed to nourish it, and its faint sun to warm it. The bleak winds have not blanched it or broken its stem, and the keen frost has not blighted it. Look, Gilbert, it is still fresh and blooming as a flower can be, with the cold snow even now on its petals. Will you have it? When I started writing this script, I never thought I would get here. I started with an idea, but the more I wrote, the more I discovered and wanted to talk about. I took many notes when I read the books, and I uncovered so many things while trying to wrap my head around them that I could have easily turned this into a much longer video. The truth is that the discussion about these books should not end here. There are still things to be addressed, quotes to be highlighted. For the moment, I think I will go on and read more of these works, and maybe do some research on the lives of the Brontë family. I said in the beginning that the themes and ideas promoted in these books stand as a foundation to the world we live in today. Now at the end, I would like to stress that the work is not over. We might have made a lot of progress. We might be miles away from where we started, but there are still women in this world that are looked down on because of their gender. There are still many prejudices and inequalities when it comes to race and social class. There are still many abuses on those that are emotionally, legally, or financially dependent on their spouse. Religion is still used as an excuse for many wrongdoings. Patriarchal structures still exist in many communities. And I'm not even talking about those societies where sadly such conduct is considered the norm. All of this can be very well disguised in democratic societies which advocate for freedom, diversity, and equality.